The biting cold of the mountain was suddenly replaced by a heat that neither of them could argue away. Pinned together in the snow, a single blunt question turned their lifelong rivalry into something far more dangerous. Before that moment on the slopes, the evening had begun in the dim, amberlit sanctuary of the Bronze Gear. For Jules Ambrose, the bar was a necessary refuge from a day that had felt like a slow-motion collision. Between the grueling demands of her final year in law school and a lingering sense of guilt regarding her mother's latest reaching out, her mental state was as frayed as the edges of her favorite coat. She sat at the weathered oak bar, the scent of stiff whiskey and wood smoke acting as a temporary balm. The peace was interrupted by a consultant who mistook her solitary presence for an invitation. He was polished, overconfident, and spoke in the buzzwords of a man who bought his personality from a brochure. Jules met his persistence with a surgical precision, her wit acting as a blade that dismantled his ego before he could even register the wound. She didn't need a savior, and she certainly didn't need the man who walked through the door a moment later. Josh Chen entered the room with the kind of effortless, golden boy arrogance that usually made Jules want to roll her eyes until they stayed that way. He was a brilliant doctor, her best friend's brother, and the primary source of her most creative insults. Their history was a roadmap of scorched-earth arguments and mutual disdain. To Josh, Jules was a chaotic, red-haired whirlwind of bad decisions and sharp tongues. To Jules, Josh was the personification of privilege and unearned confidence. When their eyes met across the crowded bar, the air didn't crackle with romance, it simmered with a familiar, high-voltage irritation. They traded barbs with the practiced ease of two people who had spent years studying each other's weaknesses just to ensure they knew exactly which buttons to press. When Jules finally decided to brave the damp, bone-chilling DC rain, the transition from the bar's warmth to the predatory stillness of the street was jarring. The city felt different at night, sharper, less forgiving. As she navigated a narrow alleyway, the shadows shifted. A man stepped forward, the dull glint of a weapon visible even in the low light. It was a moment that should have been defined by fear, but Jules felt a strange, icy calm. The adrenaline of her past, the survival instincts honed in a much harder version of Ohio, kicked in. By the time Josh reached the mouth of the alley, having followed her out of a stubborn, unwanted sense of duty, the scene was entirely unexpected. He didn't find a woman in distress. Instead, he saw Jules standing over a disarmed, trembling attacker. She held the man's own gun with a steady, terrifying competence. The rain slicked her hair against her face, and her eyes held a coldness that Josh had never seen before. He played along with her ruse, his presence adding a second layer of intimidation that sent the mugger fleeing into the night. But as they stood in the aftermath, the adrenaline didn't soften their edges. Josh was grappling with a confusing internal conflict. He hated her, yet the sight of her in the path of a bullet had made his blood run cold. He offered to walk her home, an offer she met with a barbed refusal that reminded him exactly why they didn't get along. Despite her rejection, he shadowed her from a distance, a silent vigil through the DC streets, watching until the lights in her apartment signaled she was safe. Their rivalry found a new, professional stage at the Volunteer Health and Law Clinic. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit environment, their personal animosity took on a sharper, more dangerous edge. During a disagreement over a tenant's rights case, Josh leveled a low blow that cut deeper than their usual bickering. He dismissed her as a legal tourist, someone playing at justice without understanding the life-and-death stakes he handled every day in the hospital. The insult hit a nerve, bruising the pride Jules guarded more fiercely than anything else. The fallout was a rare, heavy silence that felt worse than their screaming matches. It was only broken by a small, hesitant gesture, a simple exchange of baked goods, that acted as a temporary truce. It was the first time they allowed themselves to see the human being behind the armor. The truce deepened during their collaboration on the Bauer case. The Bauers were a family drowning in medical debt, facing eviction because of a system that didn't care about their survival. As Jules and Josh navigated the legal and medical hurdles together, they discovered a shared moral compass. Beneath the insults, they both possessed a relentless drive for justice and a deep-seated anger toward exploitation. Watching Jules fight for the family with a mix of legal brilliance and genuine empathy forced Josh to recalibrate his view of her. They were intellectual equals, and for the first time, the heat between them wasn't just fueled by anger. It was a recognition of a similar fire burning in both of them. The shifting dynamics reached a breaking point during a group trip to the mountains of Vermont. The transition from the cramped, gray streets of the city to the vast, snow-covered silence of the lodge mirrored the change in their relationship. A booking error left them with a single guest room, a space that felt far too small for the amount of tension they brought into it. The room smelled of cedar and cold air, and the presence of the single large bed was a physical weight between them. Every movement felt amplified, the sound of a suitcase opening, the brush of a shoulder as they navigated the cramped quarters. The forced proximity was stripping away the layers of protection they had spent years building, leaving a raw, electric awareness in its place. The next morning, the vast white expanse of the ski slopes provided no escape. Josh took on the role of instructor, his usual arrogance replaced by a focused, steady presence that Jules found even more unsettling. As he guided her through the mechanics of skiing, the physical closeness was constant. He held her waist to steady her, his hands warm even through their heavy winter gear. The biting wind stung their faces, but the heat where they touched was undeniable. The lesson was a study in controlled friction, a slow build of tension that finally snapped during a sudden, tangled collision. They tumbled into the snow, a chaotic mess of skis and limbs that ended with Josh pinned on top of her. The world narrowed down to the space between them, the sound of their heavy breathing, the scent of the cold, and the predatory intensity in Josh's eyes. The sharp banter was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Josh looked down at her, his guard completely dropped, and asked a blunt, dangerous question about their mutual hatred that threatened to shatter the last of their boundaries. But before Jules could find the words to respond, the moment was violently interrupted. A sudden, agonizing flare of physical pain shot through her, a familiar but terrifying darkness that caused the snow-covered world to tilt and vanish. The insults they traded usually felt like armor, but on that rain-slicked porch, the tension finally snapped. It wasn't a soft realization. It was a world-shattering collision that turned years of animosity into a fire they could no longer control. Before the explosion on the porch, the shift began in the quiet, cedar-scented air of the Vermont Lodge. The fierce independence Jules Ambrose wore like a shield vanished when a familiar, debilitating pain took hold. Stranded in their shared room, she was forced to drop her guard, as the agonizing reality of her chronic cramps left her curled in a fetal position. Josh Chen, seeing the woman who usually met him with a bared tongue now reduced to a silent, shaking mess, felt his medical instincts override his irritation. He didn't just see a rival, he saw a patient in genuine distress. He pushed past her jagged pride, using his training to provide a steady, grounding presence. The room filled with the calming, herbal scent of lavender oil as he massaged her skin, the heat of a warm compress acting as a tether to the present. The physical contact was highly charged, a low-frequency hum of awareness that neither could acknowledge. As Josh stayed by her side until she drifted into a fitful sleep, he had to confront a disturbing truth. His disdain for Jules was rapidly being eclipsed by a desire so intense it felt like a physical weight in his chest. The fragile peace of Vermont was shattered the next morning. While Jules sought a sense of normalcy at a spa with her friend Ava, a single vibration from her phone brought her world to a standstill. A message from an unknown number, containing a voice and a history she had spent 7 years trying to outrun, sent a jolt of nausea through her. Max, the man from her past in Ohio, had found her. The shock was visceral, a cold wave of fear that made her physically ill, forcing her to flee the lunch table as the ghosts of her previous life began to claw their way back to the surface. Back in the familiar, rain-streaked streets of D.C., the anxiety followed her like a shadow. Jules found herself increasingly off balance, her focus pulled between the looming threat of Max and the magnetic, irritating presence of Josh. At the clinic, seeing him in his professional element, authoritative, focused, and genuinely caring, only served to confuse her more. To vent the mounting pressure, they retreated to their usual battleground of social competition. At a crowded bar called the Black Fox, surrounded by the pulse of music and the scent of gin, they engaged in a high-stakes game of truth or dare with their colleagues. When Josh, driven by a simmering, unspoken jealousy, dared Jules to kiss someone at the table, she didn't give him the satisfaction of choosing him. Instead, she spitefully pulled a coworker named Marshall into a kiss, a move designed to sting. The night spiraled into a test of wills. When a man from Jules's past, one who had previously disrespected her, appeared and began to harass her, Josh watched with a predatory, protective loathing. He was secretly struck by the clinical, brutal efficiency with which Jules delivered a verbal takedown that left the man speechless. Their adrenaline translated into a wager, a 1-hour race to see who could collect the most phone numbers. Josh relied on his practiced, easy charm, but Jules won the bet with a move of breathtaking boldness. She had the DJ cut the music and announced to the entire room that she was looking for a rebound. The resulting swarm of interested men was a calculated victory, leaving Josh fuming in the wake of her 27-16 win. On the walk home, the victory felt hollow. Jules was so consumed by the terrifying possibility of Max's return that she stepped blindly into the street, directly into the path of an oncoming car. Josh lunged forward, his hands tight on her as he yanked her back to the safety of the sidewalk. The relief and the terror of the near-miss exploded into a vicious argument on her porch. They traded the deepest, most personal low blows they could find, using their words as weapons to keep the inevitable from happening. But the air between them was too thick with years of repressed friction. The vitriol snapped, replaced by a kiss that felt less like a beginning and more like a surrender. The encounter moved inside, turning into a ferocious power struggle. They traded sexual dares and insults as clothes were discarded, the act of intimacy becoming a cathartic purging of their shared history. It was a floor-shattering release of animosity, leaving Jules emotionally drained and wondering if the fog of hate was finally beginning to clear, or if she was simply wandering deeper into the woods. In the aftermath, Josh was consumed by the memory of the night, recognizing it as a high he couldn't easily quit. Even as he struggled with the pressures of his residency and the unwanted letters from his father in prison, his thoughts remained fixed on Jules. He eventually arrived at her door with a proposition, an enemies with benefits arrangement. Jules agreed, but only under a strict set of conditions designed to protect them both. It had to remain a secret from Josh's sister, Ava, and neither of them could fall in love. Josh accepted the terms with a smug, misplaced certainty. He was a man of science and logic. He was convinced he would never catch feelings for a woman he had spent years trying to avoid. However, the arrangement was quickly tested by the arrival of the very thing Jules feared most. During a celebration for her new apartment at a club called Hyacinth, she heard a voice from the shadows call out her old name, Jules Miller. She turned to find a gaunter, more menacing version of Max standing before her. The confrontation was a nightmare made flesh. Max reminded her of the $50,000 they had stolen from her stepfather 7 years ago in Ohio. He had spent that time in a prison cell while she had escaped to build a new life, and now he wanted his due. He revealed a devastating leverage, a sex tape he had recorded of her without her knowledge. He demanded a favor in exchange for his silence, a threat that made the walls of her new life feel like they were closing in. The arrival of Josh at the club felt like a lifeline, but Jules couldn't let him see the truth. She lied, dismissing Max as a mere acquaintance, and used a rough, desperate encounter with Josh in a supply closet to drown out the sound of her own panic. She needed the physical intensity to feel anything other than the cold dread Max had planted in her chest. That dread was briefly masked by an unexpected moment of domesticity. A severe storm trapped Jules at Josh's house overnight, forcing them into a breach of their no-sleepover rule. They argued over movies before settling on a childhood favorite of Josh's, a film that reminded him of a time before his father's incarceration. For a few hours, the armor dropped. Jules shared the pain of her father's abandonment, and Josh eventually carried her to his bed while she slept. Waking up the next morning to the sight of a shirtless Josh cooking breakfast felt dangerously comfortable. It felt like a life she could actually want. But as soon as she stepped away from the warmth of his house, reality struck back. Max sent a still image from the tape to her phone, a silent, digital reminder of the power he held. As the image glowed on her screen, Jules realized that if she couldn't find a way to satisfy Max's demands, her career, her reputation, and her entire future would be dismantled before they had even truly begun. She had spent 7 years running from the ghosts of Ohio, but when her past finally caught up to her, the person standing in the wreckage wasn't an enemy. In the middle of a town that had only ever offered her pain, Josh Chen appeared, not as a rival, but as a life raft she finally stopped trying to push away. Before the quiet streets of Ohio provided a backdrop for their healing, the shift began in the sterile, high-pressure chaos of the emergency room. For Josh, a week defined by the frantic rhythm of trauma culminated in the loss of a 17-year-old girl named Tanya. The silence that followed the girl's death was deafening, cracking the professional composure he wore like a second skin. In the cold, fluorescent light of a hospital bathroom, Josh broke down, the grief unearthing ghosts he had buried long ago, the memory of his mother's suicide and the paralyzing terror of his sister Ava's past brush with death. Devastated and unable to endure the hollow quiet of his own mind, he fled the hospital. He didn't seek out a mentor or a friend. He sought out Jules Ambrose in the law library, buried under a mountain of case files. He went to her because she was the only person who never expected him to be the perfect, unflappable doctor. In the dim, dusty sanctuary of the library stacks, the biting banter that had defined their lives for years was replaced by a heavy, profound sympathy. When Josh confessed his failure to save his patient, Jules didn't offer empty platitudes. She offered herself as a grounding force. They shared an encounter of desperate, raw connection between the bookshelves, a moment that stopped just short of physical completion due to the public setting and their mutual fatigue, but left them permanently altered. On an impulse born of this new, fragile closeness, Josh asked her to be his date for the hospital's annual picnic. It was a request that moved them beyond the shadows of their secret arrangement and into the light of his professional world. At the picnic, the masks they usually wore began to slip further. Jules found herself navigating a world of elite medical professionals, feeling the familiar sting of being judged by her appearance. The turning point arrived when a condescending colleague dismissed her as nothing more than a pretty face, questioning her intellectual capabilities. Josh didn't hesitate. He publicly defended her career and her intellect with a ferocity that stunned them both. He spoke of her brilliance not as a lover, but as a man who truly respected her work. Later, over a shared cupcake, he allowed her to see the core of his ambition, a deep-seated fear of loss that drove every stitch and diagnosis. In that moment of vulnerability, Jules realized the danger she was in. The resistance she had built against love finally broke. She was falling for him, and the realization was more terrifying than any insult they had ever traded. The momentum of their changing dynamic followed them across the ocean to Eldora for a royal wedding. The opulence of the setting provided a backdrop for a series of high-stakes near-misses. During a secret hookup in Josh's suite, they were nearly caught when Ava arrived unexpectedly. The tension was suffocating as Jules scrambled under the bed, her breath hitching when her single sparkly gold heel peeked out from beneath the bed skirt like a silent confession. Josh managed to lie his way out of the situation, but the adrenaline of the moment forced a private admission. He was becoming addicted to the very woman he was supposed to keep at arm's length. While the wedding festivities continued, Josh took Jules's earlier advice to heart and reached out to his former best friend, Alex Volkov. Over a shared beer, years of resentment were traded for a quiet, masculine reconciliation. It was a sincere apology and the first steps toward healing a friendship that had been broken by pride. However, the peace was short-lived. A frantic phone call revealed that Ava, Jules, and their friend Stella had been arrested at a local club. Jules had been bailed out after punching a man who harassed Ava, an act of loyalty that left her feeling emotionally raw. In the quiet of Josh's room afterward, the pressure of her secret past and the weight of her history finally caused a breakdown. She confronted Josh about the judgmental comments he had made to his sister years ago, and in the sincere apology he offered, they found a new, terrifying level of emotional intimacy. The day of the royal wedding stripped away the last of Jules's defenses. Watching her friends exchange vows in a display of unconditional love made her realize she could no longer hide behind their rules. At the reception, Josh's possessiveness flared when he saw her flirting with a famous soccer star. He cornered her in a private drawing room, the air thick with years of unresolved friction. When Jules desperately suggested they stick to their arrangement and date other people to protect themselves, Josh finally snapped. He discarded the rules entirely, declaring that he didn't just want her body, he wanted her heart, her soul, and a real relationship. It wasn't just a demand, it was a total surrender of his own pride. But the joy of his declaration was short-lived. 4 days later, a tragic phone call from Ohio shattered Jules's world. Her mother, Adeline, had died in a car accident. Jules was plunged into a state of hollow, protective numbness. When she arrived at Josh's house, lost and broken, he didn't hesitate. He cancelled his long-awaited trip to New Zealand to stay by her side, stepping into the role of her protector. In the safety of his arms, Jules finally revealed the full horror of her past, the neglect of her mother and the betrayal of a stepfather, Alistair, who had attempted to assault her, only for her mother to cast her out instead of protecting her. They spent the night in a purely supportive embrace, marking their first true night of emotional sanctuary. The journey toward closure led them back to Jules's hometown of Whittlesburg, Ohio. Jules was stunned to find Josh waiting at her hotel, his presence a life raft in a sea of painful memories. He used humor, claiming he was there for the local crochet museum, to mask a devotion that was now undeniable. Together, they faced the ghosts of her past. They visited the childhood haunts she had once loved and the bookstore that had been her only escape. They learned from a former classmate that her stepfather had died in disgrace following a sex scandal, leaving her mother with nothing, a revelation that brought a grim kind of justice to a life defined by his cruelty. Jules explained the significance of her name change from Miller to Ambrose, a final severing of the ties to her old life. She was no longer the girl who had been cast out. She was a woman who had built herself from the ground up. In turn, Josh opened up about the letters from his father that he had been avoiding for years, admitting his own fears of legacy and failure. By the time they prepared to leave the small town behind, Josh realized that Jules was the most extraordinary person he had ever known. Their bond was no longer a secret, a game, or a temporary arrangement. It was their shared reality. As they looked toward the future, the rivalry that had once defined them seemed like a lifetime ago, replaced by a love that had been forged in the fires of their greatest vulnerabilities. They had finally traded their weapons for promises, but a single secret remained tucked like a blade between them. In one moment of icy disbelief, the man who had become her sanctuary turned into the stranger who told her to get the fuck out. The descent toward that shattering moment began with a deceptive sense of peace in the wake of tragedy. After the quiet, hollow ceremony for her mother in Ohio, Jules found a strange sort of closure. Standing in the small, rented house where Adeline had lived, she realized there were no photos of her, no mementos of a daughter's life. Her mother had never truly cared for anyone but herself, and seeing that reality clearly allowed Jules to finally stop reaching for a ghost. Inspired by her strength, Josh decided he was ready to face his own past. As they waited for their flight back to DC, the air between them shifted. Jules admitted he was right, their connection had transcended the physical. In response, Josh asked her on a proper date, placing a playful, confident bet that once he was finished, she wouldn't be able to think about any other man. Back in the city, Josh meticulously crafted a first date that was less a social outing and more a map of their shared history. He took her on an elaborate bookstore scavenger hunt, leaving handwritten notes tucked inside her favorite novels and referencing private jokes only they understood. It was a display of deep, focused attention that proved he had been truly seeing her all along. The night transitioned into a romantic Italian dinner, punctuated by a frantic, laughing escape through a restaurant kitchen to avoid being spotted by Alex and Ava. As they shared a soulful kiss afterward, Jules felt the last of her defenses melt. She realized that while the opposite of hate might not be a simple word like love, the passion they shared was undeniably real. While their bond deepened, Josh sought final liberation from his father's shadow. He attended a baseball game with Alex, a quiet symbol of their rebuilt brotherhood, before traveling to the prison. The meeting with Michael Chen started with a mask of paternal normalcy, but it quickly disintegrated. Michael, showing his true nature, asked Josh to use his medical access to smuggle prescription pills into the facility. The betrayal was absolute. Josh exploded, calling out his father's inability to feel anything beyond his own selfish needs. Walking away from the prison, Josh felt a clean, cold sense of finality. He had cut the last tie to a man who could mimic love but never truly possess it. Seeking solace after the confrontation, Josh went straight to Jules. Their emotional reunion transitioned into an intense, highly charged encounter where Josh took dominant control, using the physical intensity to ground them both. In the quiet, intimate moments that followed, he declared his possessiveness, making it clear he didn't share when it came to her. But their peace was short-lived. A phone call from Max shattered the silence, delivering a demand that felt like a lead weight in Jules's chest. He wanted the ugly, sentimental painting from Josh's room as his final favor. The guilt began to eat at Jules from the inside out. She tried to convince Josh to get rid of the painting, only for him to admit he held a soft spot for it because it reminded him of his own failed attempts at art camp. More devastatingly, he told her she was one of the few people he truly trusted. The irony was a physical sickness. Jules wrestled with the urge to confess, but the fear of his judgment and the loss of the life they were building kept her silent. She convinced herself that the only way forward was to fulfill Max's demand and then destroy the blackmail material forever. Using Josh's spare key while he was away on a night shift, Jules orchestrated a faked burglary. She felt like a ghost in her own sanctuary as she ransacked his room, taking the painting along with his watch and iPad to make the crime look like a random act of theft. She met Max at a seedy hotel, handing over the art. It was then she learned the painting was actually a valuable piece mistakenly sold at an estate sale. Max promised to leave the city, but the lingering menace in his voice suggested he wasn't done with her. Returning home, Jules prepared for the second, more difficult phase of her plan, erasing the digital evidence and telling Josh the truth. To secure her future, Jules turned to the one man who dealt in the impossible, Christian Harper. Inside his cold, imposing penthouse, she entered into a dangerous alliance. She signed a formal contract, agreeing to a favor-for-favor exchange that left her potentially liable for $2 million if she failed to uphold her end. Armed with a wireless hacking device and the support of a silent enforcer named Koge, Jules returned to Max's hotel room under the guise of warning him the painting was a fraud. While she kept Max distracted, the device worked in the background, signaling when the digital files were finally erased. With the leverage gone, Jules revealed the truth, and with Koge's intimidating presence ensuring her exit, she retrieved the painting and left Max with a final warning. She arrived at Josh's house later that day, her heart heavy with the weight of her confession. Josh was in an excellent mood, having planned a surprise trip to New York to celebrate their future. The sight of his excitement made the coming blow even more brutal. When Jules produced the portfolio bag and confessed to the burglary and the history of Max's blackmail, the warmth in the room died instantly. Josh listened in icy disbelief. The rage that settled over him wasn't about the stolen items, it was about the profound lack of trust. He felt utterly betrayed by the woman who had claimed to be his partner but had treated him like a stranger to be managed. Despite her desperate apologies, his heart hardened into a stone. He ended the relationship with a final, cutting command, telling her to get out of his life. The aftermath was a descent into a cold, grey numbness. Jules was devastated, realizing that her fear of his judgment had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. She had destroyed the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. She moved through her days like a robot, using her broken heart as fuel to study for the bar exam with a rigid, punishing structure. She hallucinated his presence in the library, hearing his voice celebrate her successes before reality snapped back to reveal her solitude. The final blow came as she finished the first half of her exams. In a secluded stairwell, a drunk and desperate Max ambushed her, demanding the painting one last time. When he attempted to assault her, Jules fought back with the instincts of a survivor, but the struggle turned violent. Max shoved her with a desperate force, and as Jules tumbled backward down the stairs, the world tilted and spun. The last thing she felt was the hard impact of the floor before the darkness finally rose up to claim her. They had spent years trying to tear each other down, only to realize they were the only ones who knew how to hold each other up. As they took the leap together in New Zealand, the only thing Jules felt was the steady heat of Josh's hand in hers. The road to that shared horizon began in the high-stress environment of the hospital emergency room, where the lines between professional duty and personal agony blurred. Josh Chen was already in a volatile state, his patience for administrative errors and minor nursing mistakes exhausted. But the world tilted when his next patient was wheeled in, Jules Ambrose. Seeing her with a head injury and a battered shoulder, the woman who had haunted his every thought since their explosive breakup, shattered his clinical mask. The revelation that Max had been the one to push her after she finished her exams ignited an icy, protective rage that transcended any grudge he held against her. He maintained a thin veil of professional detachment while tending to her, but internally, the gears of a dark, definitive justice were already turning. He didn't just want Jules to heal, he wanted the threat that had stalked her to be erased from existence. That night, Josh sought out the only person who understood the necessity of shadow work, Alex Volkov. Together, they tracked Max to a local bar and took him to a secluded, soundproofed house. When the tape was ripped from Max's mouth and he began to spew the same vitriol and insults he had used to plague Jules, something in Josh finally snapped. The violence that followed was primal and visceral, a purging of years of frustration and the immediate terror of losing her. He beat Max until the man was a broken heap on the floor, stopped only by Alex's firm intervention. In the silence that followed, as Josh grappled with the darkness of his own actions, Alex pointed out the obvious truth that Josh had been trying to deny. His reaction wasn't just about protection. It was the undeniable proof of a man who was deeply, irrevocably in love. While Jules struggled through the recovery of a concussion and the final, grueling sections of the bar exam, she felt the weight of Josh's clinical distance. She expected his hatred, but his professional silence hurt more. However, as she stepped out of the testing site on her final day, she found him waiting. He was uncharacteristically disheveled, the polished golden boy replaced by a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. In a private office, he offered a heartfelt, raw apology for his cruelty and his lack of trust. He revealed that he had handled Max, ensuring the man would never shadow her door again, and confessed his love with a vulnerability that left her shell-shocked. But the wounds were still fresh, and Jules, needing to find her own footing, asked for space. Josh, proving his growth, promised to wait as long as it took, surrendering the control he usually craved. The tension of their separation reached a breaking point a few days later. When Jules accepted a just friend's drink with the charming soccer star Asher Donovan, Josh's jealousy was visible, yet he restrained himself, admitting that any man would be a fool to let her go. Sitting across from Asher, Jules had a sudden, sharp realization. The perfect man on paper didn't offer the friction, the fire, or the deep, soul-level understanding she shared with Josh. She was getting in her own way, clinging to a pride that no longer served her. She walked out of the bar to find Josh waiting in the shadows, and in a moment of mutual surrender, she asked him to promise that what they had was real. They reconciled with a desperate, hungry kiss, their twisted history finally giving way to a shared future. Their first true test as a couple was the revelation of their relationship to his sister, Ava. Armed with a red velvet cake as a peace offering, they arrived at Alex and Ava's apartment. The scene was initially marked by a comedic shock. Ava burst into laughter, assuming it was an elaborate prank, before the horror of her brother dating her best friend truly set in. It took a private, sincere conversation between the siblings for Ava to offer her blessing, though she punctuated it with a fierce warning that she would murder Josh if he ever hurt Jules again. With the family secret finally in the open, the air felt lighter than it had in years. While the women celebrated, the bond between the men reached its own resolution. In a quiet moment, Alex showed Josh a massive Harry Winston diamond and asked for his permission to propose to Ava. Josh granted it, realizing that Alex was the only person he trusted to protect his sister with the same intensity he felt for Jules. When Alex asked him to be his best man, the last of their old grievances were laid to rest. They began planning a future that involved bachelor parties and shared lives, recognizing that their friendship was entering a new, more mature chapter as brothers. The shadow of the past was officially banished by a news report. Max had been found dead in a Baltimore hotel, a victim of the criminal associates he had tried to outrun. For Jules, the news brought a trickle of relief, but mostly a sense of nothingness. He was a ghost she had already exorcised. This newfound freedom allowed her to fully embrace the life Josh was building for them. During a surprise trip to New York, he took her to a high-profile art exhibition in a luxury penthouse. Jules was stunned to find her ugly painting, Magda, hanging prominently between a Monet and a de Kooning. Josh revealed his strategic genius. He had sold the piece for an astronomical sum to the ruthless Dante Russo. By doing so, he hadn't just secured their financial future. He had placed the painting under the protection of a man no criminal associate would dare cross. It was the ultimate narrative win, turning a symbol of her shame into their legacy. The final culmination of their journey arrived with the results of the bar exam. Jules discovered she had passed with a stellar score of 295, a moment of triumph they celebrated with a surprise gift from Josh, tickets to the one place he had always dreamed of visiting. 4 months later, they found themselves in the rugged, breathtaking landscape of New Zealand. They had moved into a new home together, their lives now fully entwined. Standing on the edge of the Kawarau Bridge, they prepared for a tandem bungee jump. As they stood on the precipice, the wind whipping around them, the metaphor of their relationship was clear. They were taking a literal leap of faith, tied together by a bond that had been tested by fire, betrayal, and their own stubbornness. Josh leaned in, telling her he loved her even when she drove him crazy, and Jules echoed the sentiment, her heart finally free of the weight of her past. They jumped together, falling into the vast open air, the fear replaced by the exhilarating, hard-won happiness of two people who had finally stopped fighting each other and started fighting for the love they deserved. They had overcome their twisted histories to find a love that was, in the end, the only truth that mattered.